The morning my father-in-law shook my hand across the boardroom table and said, "You're done," I noticed he was wearing the cufflinks my wife had given him for Christmas, the ones I'd helped her pick out. That detail shouldn't matter, but it's the kind of thing your brain holds on to when everything else is falling apart. "My name is Joel." Wait. No. I've been doing this wrong already. Let me start over. Not with the boardroom. With what happened 3 weeks before that, because that's where the real story begins. My wife's family owned a mid-sized property development firm out of Burlington, Ontario. Hartwell and Associates. 40 years old, solid reputation, the kind of company that had its name on the side of 3 community centers and a hospital wing. My father-in-law, Reginald, had built it from a 2-man operation after immigrating from England in the 80s. He was the kind of man who wore the same Timex watch every day for 20 years because it still worked fine. I'd joined the company 6 years ago, not because I married into it, that came later, but because I was genuinely good at what I did. Commercial real estate financing. I had my designation, I had my track record, and Reginald had hired me after a 40-minute interview where he asked me exactly one question about my credentials and spent the rest of the time asking what I thought was wrong with the company's current land acquisition strategy. I told him. Apparently, that was the right answer. I married his daughter, Stephanie, 2 years after I started. I want to be clear about the order of those things, because her brother, Derek, never let me forget that I was, in his words, the guy who married his way to the top. Never mind that I'd been there first. Never mind that I'd restructured 3 failing projects that Derek himself had greenlit on gut instinct and bad math. Never mind any of it. In Derek's version of events, I was an outsider who'd gotten lucky. Reginald knew better. That's what I kept telling myself, the 3 weeks before the boardroom. Reginald had been sick. Not the kind of sick you talk about openly, but the kind where you notice your father-in-law has started losing weight and stops ordering his usual steak at family dinners and switches to soup. When I asked Stephanie about it, she went quiet in a way that told me she knew more than she was saying. I found out from our accountant, of all people. Reginald had stage 3 pancreatic cancer. He'd known for 2 months. He hadn't told me. He had told Derek. I don't know what hurt more, the fact that he was sick, or the fact that I was the last one to know. What I found out later was that during those 2 months, Derek had been very busy. Board meetings I wasn't invited to. Amendments to the partnership agreement that were circulated for signatures while I was in Vancouver for a site visit. Legal consultations I knew nothing about. By the time Reginald sat me down in his office, not the boardroom, his actual office, with the framed photos of the firm's first project on the wall and the ugly brass paperweight his wife had given him, and told me about the cancer himself, the paperwork was already done. Derek had maneuvered himself into the majority-controlling position. It was all perfectly legal. I'd signed something months ago, some routine amendment that I hadn't read carefully enough. 26 pages. Page 18. "I'm sorry, son," Reginald said, and I believed him. I think that was the worst part. I genuinely believed him. 3 weeks later, Derek called the boardroom meeting. Reginald wasn't there. He was at home by then, too tired to drive. Derek sat at the head of the table and said that given the transition in leadership, the company was going in a new direction, and that my particular role was being restructured. There was a severance package on the table in front of me. 12 weeks. My personal items would be couriered to my home address. My wife was not in that meeting. I drove home in a kind of fog that I can only describe as the opposite of panic. Completely still, completely numb. Stephanie was in the kitchen when I got home. She looked at me and she already knew. Her eyes told me she'd known it was coming. "He's my brother," she said, before I could say anything. That was it. That was her explanation. I want to be fair here, because I've had a long time to think about it. She was caught between her family and her husband, and she chose the side she'd known her whole life. I understand that, in theory. What I couldn't forgive, what I still haven't fully forgiven, is that she didn't warn me. She knew what Derek was doing, and she let me walk into that boardroom blind. We separated 3 months after that. The divorce was finalized the following spring. I was 31 years old, living in a month-to-month rental in Hamilton, with a severance package that had already mostly gone to the lawyer and a resume that listed 6 years at a company my ex-wife's family now controlled. Every reference I had was tangled up in that place. Every connection. I had $480 in my personal checking account. I know that number exactly because I checked it in the parking lot of a Tim Hortons at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning. Sitting in a car I was 3 payments behind on, trying to figure out what came next. What came next was a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a lawyer named Patricia. No, wait, I should not use that name. It was a lawyer, a woman I'd never met, calling from a firm in Kitchener I'd never heard of. She told me that my wife's grandfather, Reginald's father, a man named Aldous, had passed away 8 months earlier, and that there was a matter relating to his estate that required my attention. I almost laughed. Reginald's father had died while all of this was happening, and nobody had told me that either. The lawyer explained that Aldous had left something to me specifically. Not to Reginald, not to Derek, not to Stephanie, to me. In a handwritten codicil added to his will 14 months before his death, Aldous Pemberton, 83 years old, retired schoolteacher, man I had met exactly 4 times, had left me his property. A farmhouse, 45 minutes north of Owen Sound on the Bruce Peninsula. I'd been there once, 5 years ago, on a long weekend with Stephanie. It was the kind of place that felt like it had been forgotten by time. A 2-story century home at the end of a gravel road, fields that hadn't been farmed in a decade. A woodshed that leaned 5 degrees to the east, and a front porch that sagged in the middle like a tired old horse. Beautiful in the way that falling down things sometimes are, but not livable, not without serious work. The lawyer told me that Aldous had specifically excluded Reginald and Derek from this bequest. She read me the exact wording from the codicil. To my grandson-in-law, whom I believe to be a man of honest character, I leave the property at concession 7, knowing that he will understand what to do with it, and knowing that the others will not. I sat in that Tim Hortons parking lot for a long time after the call ended. I didn't know what to do with a broken-down farmhouse in Gray County. I barely knew how to change a light bulb. But I had $480, a car I was behind on, and exactly nowhere else to go. I drove up there the next afternoon. The gravel road was worse than I remembered. My car scraped bottom twice before I got to the end of it. When the house came into view, I sat for a moment with the engine running, just looking at it. The porch had gotten worse. One of the second-floor windows was broken, covered with a piece of plywood that had warped and split. The barn at the back had lost most of its roof on one side. The fields were chest-high in goldenrod and Queen Anne's lace, but the bones were there. I could see that, even then, even knowing nothing. The stone foundation was solid. The walls were plumb. The chimney was intact. I turned the engine off and got out. Inside, the house smelled like old wood and something faintly sweet, like dried apples. The kitchen had a cast iron wood stove that looked like it might still work, and a hand pump by the sink that definitely didn't. The living room had a stone fireplace with a birch mantel and a view of the back fields through 2 tall windows. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms, all empty, all cold. Aldous had left the furniture, such as it was, a metal bed frame, a kitchen table with 1 uneven leg, a wooden rocker by the front window. That first night, I slept on the floor of the living room in my jacket, because I hadn't thought to bring a sleeping bag, and I woke up at 3 in the morning to the sound of something moving in the walls. Mice. I'd find out later. A whole civilization of them, and I lay there in the dark, listening to the house, breathe around me, and I thought, okay, this is what you have. What are you going to do with it? I had no contractor money. I had no skilled trades contacts outside of commercial real estate, which is a completely different world from actual construction. What I had was a laptop, the library in Owen Sound 45 minutes away, and a stubbornness that people who know me would call a character flaw. I started learning. I spent the first 2 weeks doing nothing but research and assessment. Drove to the library every morning, used their internet, took out every book they had on residential renovation, structural repair, old-growth timber framing, watched tutorial videos, made lists, made lists of my lists, walked every inch of that house with a flashlight and a notepad and marked everything that was wrong, and then ranked them by what would make the building uninhabitable versus what was just ugly. The roof was the first priority. Part of it over the back bedroom had given way, and there was water damage in the ceiling below. I couldn't hire a roofing crew. I found a retired contractor named, I should call him my neighbor, because that's what he became, who lived 4 kilometers down the road and who came by one afternoon after I'd been there a week, ostensibly to introduce himself, but actually, I think, to size me up. He was in his 70s, gray-bearded, drove a truck that was older than I was. He walked around the outside of the house once, quietly, and then said, "You planning to do this yourself?" I said I was planning to try. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "Come find me when you get to the roof." His name was, I'll call him my neighbor, I'll call him Gil. Because that's what everyone called him, short for something he never told me. Gil had retired from 30 years in the trades and had opinions about everything, and was almost always right. He didn't help me out of charity. He helped me because he was bored and because I think he respected that I wasn't pretending to know things I didn't know. Every time I didn't know something, I said so. He seemed to find that unusual. The roof took us 3 weekends. I paid for the materials, salvaged metal roofing from a demolition sale in Collingwood, which Gil negotiated down to something I could actually afford, and I did whatever Gil told me to do, and by the end of it the back bedroom was dry, and the house stopped losing heat through the ceiling. From there, I worked through the list. The hand pump needed a new leather cup and a lot of patience, but it worked, eventually, pulling cold, clean water up from the old dug well. The wood stove needed a new door gasket and a chimney cleaning. The electrical panel was a disaster. Knob and tube in the oldest section, updated badly sometime in the 90s, and for that I had to hire an actual licensed electrician, which took most of what was left of my severance. But the inspector signed off on it, and I stopped worrying about the house burning down, which let me sleep better. The floors were white ash, under 40 years of grime, and a layer of linoleum someone had glued down in the kitchen. I rented a floor sander from a place in Owen Sound and spent a full weekend on my knees, and what came up underneath was extraordinary. Wide plank flooring, honey-colored, almost glowing. I sat on the floor of my own kitchen at 11 o'clock on a Sunday night and ran my hand along the grain and thought about Aldous walking on those same boards for decades. And I felt something shift in my chest that I didn't have a word for. I was 6 months in by then. I'd found some part-time consulting work. A small developer in Barrie who needed someone who understood commercial financing and who didn't care about my history with Hartwell. It wasn't much, but it kept the hydro on and the propane tank from running empty. The bedroom at the back of the house, the master bedroom, the one Aldous had slept in for 40 years, I left for last, not for any particular reason at first. It just kept getting pushed down the list. There was always something more urgent. When I finally got to it, in the late fall, the light was going by 4 in the afternoon, and the fields outside were brown and frostbitten. The room was smaller than I remembered, wide plank floors, the same as the rest of the house. A single window looking north, toward the woodlot, an old wardrobe which I'd already moved to check for mold behind it, and a closet in the east wall. The closet. That's where the strangeness started. The closet door opened on a space that was, by my measurement, about 2 feet deep and 4 feet wide. But when I went outside and looked at the house from the east side, the distance between the exterior wall and the room's interior wall was closer to 6 feet. I'd measured walls before. That gap bothered me. I went back inside and pressed on the back wall of the closet. Plaster over lath, same as the rest of the house. I knocked on it. The sound was hollow. I stood there for a while, thinking. Aldous had been a practical man. Reginald had said so, many times. He didn't do anything without a reason. He certainly didn't lose 4 feet of closet space to a hollow wall without a reason. I found the seam eventually. Not by looking, but by feeling. Running my fingers along the edge of the baseboard at the bottom of the back wall, I felt a gap where there shouldn't have been one. The baseboard wasn't nailed. It was set in a channel, so it could be lifted out. Behind the baseboard was a small iron hook, set flush into the plaster, painted over so many times it had become almost invisible. When I turned it, something clicked. The back wall of the closet swung inward. The space on the other side was not large, maybe 4 feet deep, 6 feet wide, running the full height of the room. Rough-cut boards on the floor, bare studs on the walls. A single small window, north-facing, that I'd noticed from the outside but had never been able to account for. It was too high to see into from the ground, and the window itself had been covered on the inside with a piece of painted canvas. There was a metal shelving unit against the far wall, the old kind with adjustable wire shelves, and on it were several items. A canvas bag, military issue, olive drab, stamped with a date that put it sometime in the late 1960s. A wooden box, the kind that might once have held cigars but was heavier than it should have been. 3 sealed mason jars, the old style with glass lids and rubber seals, each one filled with what looked like folded papers. And on the bottom shelf, wrapped in a Hudson's Bay point blanket, the old 4-stripe wool, red and yellow and green and indigo, a metal cash box with a combination lock. I didn't touch anything immediately. I'm not sure how long I stood in the doorway of that hidden room, just looking. The air inside was still and cool, the way old spaces smell when they've been closed up for decades. Dust on every surface, undisturbed. Whoever had put these things here, they'd been here a long time. I started with the canvas bag. Inside, tools. Old hand tools, well-maintained, wrapped in oilcloth. A small draw knife. A set of mortise chisels. A hand plane with a blade so carefully sharpened it caught the light. These were craftsman's tools, and they'd been packed with care. The wooden box had a small brass clasp that opened without a lock. Inside, on a bed of aged cotton batting, were medals. Military medals. I didn't know what they all were. One was clearly a service medal. The red and white ribbon faded to rose and cream. But there were others, and they'd been arranged with deliberate care. And there was a photograph tucked underneath them of a young man in uniform who looked enough like Reginald that I recognized the jaw and the set of the shoulders. This was Aldous. This was what Aldous had looked like at 22. The mason jars took longer. I brought them out into the bedroom where the light was better and worked the stiff rubber seals carefully, trying not to tear them. The papers inside were dry and brittle at the edges but largely intact. The first jar. Letters. Love letters, I understood quickly, though I only read the first 2 before folding them back. Between Aldous and his wife, from the years before they were married. I set these aside with care. These weren't mine to read. The second jar. Documents. Property surveys, old ones, hand-drawn, deeds and certificates. And at the bottom of the stack, something I recognized immediately because of my work. Share certificates. Private company shares in a business whose name I didn't know, Pennant Holdings Limited, signed by Aldous as both issuer and first shareholder, dated 1971. I stared at these for a long time. The third jar contained a single sealed envelope, letter-sized, with my full name written on the outside in shaky handwriting. Not my married name, not the family name. My own name, my first and last. My hands were not entirely steady when I opened it. The letter was 2 pages, written by hand, in the careful, upright script of a man who had been taught penmanship as a real skill. It was dated 16 months before Aldous died, which meant he had written it when he was already ill, when he must have known what was coming. And it was addressed to me by name, which meant he had known, long before the codicil was written, who he intended to leave this property to. He wrote that he had watched me. That sounds strange out of context, but what he meant was that in the 4 years since Stephanie and I had married, he had been observing how I conducted myself, in the family, in the business, in the small moments that people think no one notices. He wrote that he had asked questions quietly of people who knew me. He wrote that he had read, in the business press, about 2 projects I'd rescued at Hartwell that had been publicly attributed to the firm, but never to me specifically. He wrote that he knew what Derek was, had always known what Derek was. He wrote, My son Reginald has a good heart and poor judgment about people he loves, which is perhaps the most common kind of blindness there is. He wrote that the shares in Pennant Holdings were real and had never been dissolved. He wrote that Pennant Holdings had a claim, properly documented, to a percentage of Hartwell and Associates' founding capital, a debt that had never been acknowledged and had been, in his word, absorbed. He explained the history in 2 careful paragraphs. It was technical and dense, and I had to read it 3 times, but by the 3rd time I understood what he was saying. He was saying that Reginald's company, Derek's company now, had been built in part on money that had never been properly repaid to Pennant Holdings, which was to say to Aldous, which was to say, now, to me. He wrote that he wasn't certain the claim was legally enforceable after so many years. He wrote, "I am not a vindictive man. I did not choose to pursue this during my lifetime because I did not want to damage what my son had built. But I believe that the record should exist and that someone honest should hold it. What you do with it is your decision." And at the very bottom of the 2nd page, in handwriting that had grown smaller and more effortful, as if he was tiring, "Rebuild the house. It wants to be lived in. I'm sorry it's in such a state. I ran out of time." I sat on the floor of that bedroom for a long time. The light had gone fully by then, just the one lamp I'd set up while I was working. The fields outside were dark. It was very quiet. I thought about what I'd lost in the past year, the job, the marriage, the future I thought I was building. I thought about Derek sitting in the boardroom chair that used to be Reginald's, and Reginald at home in a hospital bed, and Stephanie not saying a word. And I thought about this old man, whom I had met 4 times, who had spoken perhaps 40 words to me in total, who had given me nothing but a strong handshake and an unexpectedly direct look, who had been paying attention to all of it, quietly, from a distance, and had done the one thing that was in his power to do. I didn't cry. I'm not sure why not. I think I was too tired, and too full of something that wasn't grief exactly, more like recognition. I put everything back carefully. The jar with the love letters I set aside, separate from the rest. Those I would leave alone. The rest, the deeds, the share certificates, Aldous' letter, I photographed carefully with my phone, then brought everything to Owen Sound the next morning and locked it in a safety deposit box at the credit union. Then I called a lawyer, not a big firm, a woman who worked out of a 2-room office above a hardware store in Owen Sound, who had a reputation for being thorough and for not overcharging, and who, when I explained the situation over 90 minutes one Tuesday afternoon, listened without interrupting, and then said, "Give me 3 weeks." She called me back in 10 days. The claim wasn't straightforward, she said. Nothing like this ever was. But it was real. Aldous had been meticulous. The original loan documents were among the papers in the second jar. I hadn't recognized them as such, but she did immediately. A private loan from Aldous to Reginald in 1978, interest-free, intended to capitalize what would become Hartwell and Associates, never formally repaid, and never converted to equity as originally discussed. The amount, with any reasonable accounting for the value of capital over time, was significant. The shares in Pennant Holdings, if the claim was successful, represented a stake in the company's founding that had simply been overlooked. Whether overlooked intentionally or through the particular amnesia that affects people when money is involved. She said she couldn't know. She suspected the latter. People remember generosity differently than the generous do. She sent a formal letter to Hartwell and Associates legal counsel. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I think people expect a courtroom scene, a dramatic confrontation, someone crying in a boardroom. It wasn't like that. It was slow, lawyers exchanging letters, an independent audit of historical records. Derek, through his counsel, initially dismissing the claim as frivolous. Then, when the audit began turning things up, becoming less dismissive. Reginald died in February. That part I don't want to dwell on. He died at home, with his family, and I was not there, and that's something I live with. But before he died, a few weeks before, he called me. I almost didn't pick up. It was a Sunday evening, and his name on my screen felt like it belonged to a different life. He said, "I know you found it." He'd known about the hidden room, of course. Had known it existed since he was a boy, though he'd told me once, years ago, that his father had sealed it up when Reginald was a teenager and never explained why. He'd always assumed it was something to do with his father's privacy, his war years, and he'd respected that. He said, "My father was a better judge of character than I was." He said, "I'm sorry about all of it." I told him I knew. I told him I didn't hold it against him, which was mostly true. He died 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday early morning. I found out from Stephanie, who sent a text. I drove out to the property that afternoon and sat on the porch in the cold. The porch I'd rebuilt by then, new boards, new posts. It didn't sag anymore. And I looked at the fields and the woodlot beyond them, and I thought about all the people who had lived in this house and what they'd carried and what they'd left behind. The legal matter was resolved, eventually, about 7 months after Reginald died. I won't pretend it was a victory in any clean sense. The settlement was private. Derek and the board agreed to terms that acknowledged the historical debt and compensated Pennant Holdings, which is to say, me, accordingly. It wasn't a fortune, it wasn't life-changing wealth, not on its own, but it was enough to finish the house. Enough to buy out the rest of the year without the part-time consulting. Enough to think about what came next from a position that wasn't desperation. What came next was the house, still. It was always the house. I'd been working on it for over a year by that point. The roof was solid, the electrical was up to code, the kitchen had a new propane range that cooked evenly. I'd refinished the floors throughout, patched the plaster in 3 rooms, rebuilt the back porch, replaced 2 exterior doors that had been letting the cold in all winter. The woodshed was stable. The barn was. The barn was a project for another year. But the master bedroom, I left the hidden room as it was, mostly. I framed in a proper door where the concealed wall had been, and I built shelves along one side, and I hung Aldous' service photo in a frame above them. The tools I kept on the lowest shelf, oiled and wrapped. The metal box I kept locked. His love letters I kept in the mason jar, sealed, and set them beside his photo. It felt right that the room should be a room again, used, visible, open, while still holding what it was. By the following September, the house was livable in a way that felt real. Not magazine livable, not done. Houses are never done, I understood that now, but honest. The kind of place where the light came in right, and the floors were warm underfoot, and you could sit at the kitchen table with a coffee on a Saturday morning, and feel the particular stillness that old houses have when they've been cared for. Gil came over for dinner that October. He walked through every room slowly, the way he had the first time, and didn't say much. At the end he stood on the front porch and looked out at the fields, which I'd had cut back, and the lane, which I'd graveled properly, and he said, he would have been pleased. I didn't say anything. The old man, Gil said, he was a good neighbor. Kept to himself, but good. I hadn't known that. I hadn't known Gil had known Aldous. I asked him. Gil said they'd talked, over the years, that Aldous had spoken about his family sometimes. That once, a few years back, Aldous had said something to Gil that Gil had remembered but never fully understood until now. He said he had somebody in mind for the place, Gil said. He said he just had to wait and see if the situation worked itself out in the right direction. I stood there on my own porch, in the October dark, and I thought about an 80-year-old man, watching the slow unfolding of his family's choices and mischoices, writing a letter addressed to someone who wasn't family yet, setting aside share certificates in a sealed jar, trusting that the right person would eventually find them. He'd waited a long time. I've been out here 2 years now, going on 3. The consulting work has grown into something real. I took on a partner last year, a woman who does the development side while I handle financing, and we work mostly remotely, which means the gravel road and the 45 minutes from Owen Sound haven't been obstacles. The barn is a project I'll start next spring. The fields are leased to a farmer down the road who runs beef cattle on the back 40. In the evenings sometimes I can hear them from the porch, low and distant. Stephanie reached out once. About a year after the settlement, she'd heard from someone how the legal matter had resolved, and she wanted, I think, to understand how it had come together. Maybe to apologize, maybe just to know. I didn't call her back. That's the one part of this I'm still not entirely at peace with. Maybe someday. Derek I haven't spoken to. That one I'm at peace with. What I think about, more than any of it, is that letter. Those 2 pages in an old man's careful handwriting. The part where he said the house wanted to be lived in. The part where he said he'd run out of time. I think about the tools on the shelf in the hidden room. The draw knife, the chisels, the hand plane with the perfectly sharpened blade. Someone had cared for those tools over a long life, kept them ready, wrapped them in oilcloth so they'd still be useful to whoever came next. That kind of care is a form of faith. Faith that there would be a whoever. Faith that the whoever would know what to do with them. I use the tools now. Not often, not expertly, but I use them. I'm learning. That's what I would have told Aldous Pemberton if I'd ever had the chance. That I'm learning. That the porch doesn't sag anymore. That the floors are warm. That I sat at his kitchen table this morning with my coffee and watched the first snow come down over the woodlot, and it was very quiet, and the house felt like mine.